Now, I want to be clear here. There's a lot of charlatans, there's a lot of woo, but that doesn't mean there aren't real phenomena. Nobody gets addicted to psychedelics. No, they get addicted to rabbit hole metaphysics. That's what happens, is their own idiosyncratic, completely egocentric, thick metaphysics.
I sat down with John Vervaeke, an award-winning professor of cognitive science and Buddhist psychology, to discuss rabbit hole metaphysics, the sometimes weird, outlandish stuff people believe thanks to the internet. According to Vervaeke, the current mainstream metaphysics, physicalism, has brought us to the meaning crisis.
What you have is a worldview that purports to explain everything except how you, as a meaning maker, actually belong in that world. So you have the problem that we generate this worldview from which we are radically alienated, radically disconnected.
As Vervaeke approaches the meaning crisis and metaphysics scientifically, I thought he would be interested in the relationship between physics and consciousness. But when I brought it up, he kindly made clear to me that we have to think about cognition first.
I don't want you to tell me how your theory of consciousness is compatible with physics. I want your theory of consciousness to tell me how it's compatible with cognition. Because if you can't do that, I don't care about the compatibility with physics.
All our models and formal descriptions of the world, including physics, are based on assumptions that are a product of the human mind. And here's the thing, we cannot derive the truth of these assumptions from the systems that are themselves based on these assumptions. Here's Vervaeke explaining this.
I can run all possible computations within predicate calculus, and I'll never get modal logic. Because I have to step outside, and from outside introduce an axiom and a new function.
Each era in history had a dominant metaphysics that was captivated in compelling mythologies. Think of animism, Zoroastrianism, or the Abrahamic religions. Now, according to Vervaeke, the dominant myth of our day and age is that of the zombie.
Oh my God. Zombies typically don't have a supernatural origin. They're sort of us decayed, which is really interesting. They're frequently hungry for brains, which is a weird thing, the organ of meaning making, presumably. They consume and they are never satisfied. They move around in a horde, but they have no communal existence whatsoever. They have no history. They have no culture. They're drifting aimlessly.
I found it confronting that all our zombie apocalypse storytelling is in a sense about us. It mirrors back a culture that denies transcendence, only cares for material well-being, while that never truly satisfies us, and it denies a deeper meaning to life. Now, there are of course avenues out of this. Think for instance about meditation, mindfulness, or mystical type experiences people have. But Vervaeke warns us that these practices or experiences need to be embedded in a worldview that truly acknowledges them.
An ecology of practices needs a homing worldview that legitimates it and properly authorizes people to be teachers and guides. And that's what the religions used to do. I'm not advocating for religion here, but you can't just say, you know what I'll do is I'll take it out of all of that and I'll plug it in over here and it'll continue to work. And that's just profound self-deception. That's just profound and here's the thing, Hans, that actually exacerbates the meaning crisis because it keeps you locked in to the very mindset that is driving the meaning crisis.
If we have a functional approach to formerly religious practices, so we do meditation, what we want nothing to do with the metaphysics of Buddhism, we risk that in the end this only reinforces the meaning crisis. So what then is a true solution out of the meaning crisis according to Vervaeke?
We should have a thin description, but we should orient towards a strong transcendence because that is the relationship that has the greatest potential to transform us, grow us up, develop us, mature us. So we should have a thin description of a strong transcendence.
Right now we have a thick description, a thick theory of non-transcendence, and it's called materialism. Can we indeed move towards a thin description while being open to strong transcendence?
Now what's happening is the recovery of the vertical. We're realizing that we are not just historical political beings, but we're recovering that we participate ontologically in a vertical fashion. What Plato and the Neoplatonists were talking about, that to me is very, very significant. We can actually, as Plotinus would say, we can become more at one with the one. It's as much at the bottom coming up
Yeah,
as it is from the top, and it completely
yeah.
interpenetrates.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Professor John Vervaeke. And if you like content like this, may I ask you to subscribe and like our channel, as it really helps us to grow and make more content like this. And I think if I may open a bit personal, if that's okay with you, I was
Please.
wondering, I mean, you're a lot on YouTube and you have your own series, and just you're out there with this message of the meaning crisis and how to tackle it, and now with mentoring the machines. And I was wondering, to what degree does this come from what Joseph Campbell would say, or no, Jung, that's Jung, right? The wounded healer. So I was thinking, what has there been a sort of personal meaning crisis, John, that
Yeah.
makes you now so invested?
Yeah, there was. I mean, in some ways analogous to you. I was brought up in an extended family of fundamentalist Christianity that I would now call quite traumatizing. I had some of the most terrifying experiences of my life within that framework. And then, like you, I left it. But even if it has some toxic elements to it, religion leaves a taste for the transcendent in your mouth. And, I went looking for it. I bumped up very readily in high school into, some aspects of nihilism. But then I went to university and I encountered the figure of Socrates. And uh, this opened me up to what I was hungry for, a kind of spirituality that was deeply interwoven with rationality, a much broader conception of rationality than our current one, and with the cultivation of wisdom and virtue. And this was exactly what I was looking for. Socrates is still very, very important to me. I did a whole other series called After Socrates to try
Yeah.
and open that up for people. Um, and that was good, but what happened, and I'm glad it did, because I was still very much in sort of a purely propositional mode around this and reading and arguing and reflecting. But the topic of wisdom itself fell off the table in academic philosophy at that time. And I went on in philosophy because I appreciate the skills and et cetera, et cetera. But I was hungry again, and so down the road, literally down the road from me, was a Tai Chi and meditation center. So I went there and I started practicing, and I have been practicing since. What I would now call an ecology of practices. I was doing Vipassana meditation, Tai Chi Chuan, and meta contemplation. And then as this was unfolding, my love for Socrates and Plato, of course, wasn't abated. And I ran into the work of Pierre Hadot and philosophy as a spiritual exercise, as he would put it. That started to wake me up to the Western wisdom cultivation tradition, ancient philosophy, which I was already oriented to because of Socrates. And then I was also hearing about this new discipline called cognitive science, in which people were starting to talk again about meaning and altered states of consciousness, and all of it came together for me. And so I started teaching a couple of courses at the university, one called Buddhism and Cognitive Science, another one, a course on higher cognitive processes, which I turned into a course on the psychology of wisdom. And my students, when I was talking about these topics, they were like, and I realized, oh, there's something more going on here. And then I started to really, as I was developing these courses and develop, you always have to know about 10 times more than you teach, right? And so I was doing this expansive exploration, and into both the history of the meaning crisis, and then more and more the cognitive science of what is meant by this metaphor of meaning in life. And then I had a student come up to me who'd taken these courses, and he said, "You should do something on YouTube. My father's a professional editor. I'm a professional videographer, and I got a crew, and we'll do it for free as long as you give us credit." And I said, "Yes." And that became Awakening for the Meaning Crisis. And then it just took off from there.
The rest is history. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. And I think nice for this conversation to first tap into sort of, because before going to sort of the solutions, of course, the problem. And I really liked reading Zombies in Western Culture, where you, I
Oh yeah.
think, quote Deleuze when saying that the only modern myth is the myth of zombies.
Yeah, yeah.
I like that. Okay, but could you please explain to people who haven't read that book why you think that sentence is true?
Well, I want to thank my dear friend Christopher Mastropietro and my co-author Philip Mizovic. That book was a way of bringing together a lot of that exploration I had mentioned to you and bringing it into a more clear and coherent argumentative form. And so, what we were trying to do in that book was pick up on the appearance of this new myth, the myth of the zombie. Deleuze might be a little bit. People have said, but what about Frankenstein? And I say, well, maybe that's a little too early. But anyways, I don't want to quibble about stuff like that. So, like when we were asking the question why, and I had started building the argument. Oh, well, myths typically express something that's sort of otherwise incoherent, but nevertheless sort of perennial, but also pertinent and profound. And I really started reflecting on this idea. Well, maybe they're the articulation in mythic form of the experience of the meaning crisis. And then we just laid out the argument. Look at all the features of the zombie and how they're so different from the other monsters in horror. I mean, so just a few right away. Zombies typically don't have a supernatural origin. They're sort of us decayed, which is really interesting. They're frequently hungry for brains, which is a weird thing, the organ of meaning making, presumably. They consume and they are never satisfied. They move around in a horde, but they have no communal existence whatsoever. They have no history. They have no culture. They're drifting aimlessly, uh, uh, and and they um, how can I put this? They don't represent what you would call sort of supernatural evil. They represent this other. They represent more of this things going radically wrong in a different way. And then we noticed that that myth had magnetized with another myth that, of course, has an independent existence, the myth of the apocalypse. And we got the, oh, well, and people were, and I mean, even at the time, people were going around and they would refer in conversation to the zombie apocalypse as if it was a future event. Um, and the apocalypse originally, of course, is a Christian idea, and it's the idea of the final revelation, the disclosure of the new world. Um, and then we realized, oh, the zombie is also a perversion of the Christian myth of resurrection, and then that's getting bound up. And then we see a perversion of the apocalypse into the loss of the old world, but no disclosure of the new world. It's just a continual drifting away and losing of this world. And then I thought, well, put those two together, and you've got a lot of the machinery of the meaning crisis running.
How does that work with zombies, right? Because if the solution in these myths, I'm not that. Where sort of what's the way sort of to kill the zombies or to get back to sort of the
Okay, so this is the thing, Hans. This is what also is really important, and it's part of what the myth is conveying. Because typically, like, the monster has a lair, the zombies are homeless. So tracking down the lair, like you do with a vampire or the werewolf or even the ghost, doesn't do anything because there is no, there is no archetypal origin that it's bound to. And if you kill a zombie, nothing changes. You kill tons of them, and there's just more. And so there isn't this is frequently the thing. There isn't in these movies typically an answer. World War Z sort of tried to give a solution. Somehow the whole world would marshal and there'd be a world war. But what we noted is that very frequently the answer is just that there is no answer. It's this sense of, right, which is also often how people feel in the meaning crisis, a feeling of existential entrapment. Uh, and the only answers that come out, the classic answer, and it's not really an answer, but it's the deep response. In I'm trying to think of the name of the big series. I keep thinking of The Walking Dead is what they called it. But anyways, that series where they say on more than one occasion they say we are the Walking Dead. I think that was the name of the show actually. We are the Walking Dead. Um, because it's interesting. Very often, one of the tropes of the genre is you don't actually call zombies zombies in the TV show or in the movie. They've broken that a little bit more recently, but this idea that the only thing that comes to people is not any kind of deliverance or salvation or resolution. The only thing they come to is a kind of realization that there's no deep difference between them and the zombies, the people.
Mm. And
That
where would you say that if we look at history and we look at the mythologies that are sort of dominant, what was the turning point that we sort of turned to this mythology? Would you, I mean, for instance, I was thinking, is it Nietzsche? Sort of the one reading, of course, of Nietzsche would make that possible, saying is this nihilist God is that culture that has brought us here. But where would you point sort of the
so Hans, there's two potential questions you're asking me. One is where would I point to sort of the origin of the myth, and where would I point to the origin of the crisis? Which are you
yeah,
asking?
exactly. I'm asking both, but perhaps better to go to sort of the origin of the crisis. I think for people that's the most important question here.
Yeah. So what where you have to look for is you have to step back, um, and you have to ask at what level are we talking, and we're talking at the level of what anthropologists like Clifford Geertz call a worldview. And in a worldview, you have two interlocking things. You have a theory of how the world is knowable, and then you have like how you can know the world. You have a theory of knowing. Let's put it
Yeah,
that way.
your epistemology, right? Yeah.
Yeah, you have an epistemological account, and then you have an account of how the world is ontologically knowable. How is the world structured such that
Yeah.
it is intelligible to us? And then how do those fit together so that I can model the world to me as an arena for my action, and I
Mm-hmm.
can model myself as an agent that belongs and fits in that arena? And this is sort of your meta meaning system. This is this ancient arena structuring between the epistemological and the ontological gives you an overarching sort of cultural cognitive grammar for how you can develop more specific meaning systems like the legal system or an ethical system or a religious system or an aesthetic system or even a popular entertainment culture, etc. So you have this overarching worldview. And then what I did in the series was I tried to trace out, well, where does this worldview have its origin? Where does it come to sort of a fruition? And then how does it fall apart? And so the main argument, do you want me to go into those three moments, or do you
Yeah,
want?
nice. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so the main argument I made that our worldview. So one way to see it is, I'll do this with my students. I'll say, how many of you have read the Egyptian Book of the Dead, or the Epic of Gilgamesh? And maybe one or two people put up their hands, and then I'll say, well, how many of you, have read the Bible or read some Plato? And a lot of people put up their hands, and I say, well, notice how we identify with texts up to a certain date, and then we don't identify with the texts older than that, right? And that's sort of around what Carl Jaspers and Karen Armstrong and other people call the axial revolution. Whether or not it was a revolution or a transition, or whether it was, I don't want to get into all those historical subtleties. All I need is something major changed. There was a collapse of the Bronze Age, you know, empires, and we got a period of sort of everything. There was it was a very hard time. And then when civilization starts to rebuild, people are much more experimental. There's a whole bunch of new psychotechnologies. And what you get in the axial revolution is you get things like alphabetic literacy and numeracy in Greece, and the rise of democratic institutions in which you have to justify. And so you get this, what Bella called second order thinking. All human beings have metacognition. They can reflect on their cognition, but you get this empowerment of that second order thinking, so people can bring a much more powerful reflective critical awareness to bear. And what you get is the realization of how much we are the cause of suffering. You go from like individuals doing things that cause suffering to no, no, no. The way we see the world is somehow fundamentally wrong. It's illusory, or it's fallen, or we're sinful, or we're out of harmony, but this fundamental sense that um, we need to engage in a very comprehensive form of self-correction, self-transcendence. And so you even get this creation, which eventually becomes problematic, of a new mythology. You get a two worlds mythology. There was also always a stack in the ancient world, but this is different. There's a world, and the lower world is somehow illusory, decadent, fall. It's less real. This is a new idea. And then there's a super world that is more real. And we need to get there in order to realize our full reality and come into the fullness of human being. And so you get all of this movement towards transcendence. And then what you have is you have two major streams. Now
And
I'm
this
moving.
is like 2,500 years ago, right? I'd say like
No,
Plato, Christianity, or
so no, this is more. This is well, yes, it's about 2,500 years ago. I mean, the Axial revolution probably starts a little bit earlier, but that's close. That's good. That's good. Okay, so you get two streams in what becomes the West. You've got both of these founding peoples have both aspects, but there's a difference in emphasis. In Greece, you had a very much an emphasis on what I call the vertical dimension. What are the levels of reality, and how does knowing and being move up and down these levels? And so this is very much the Platonic metaphor. Now, of course, the Hebrews have the up and down, but they place a much greater emphasis on history. They place a greater emphasis on moving from the world of enslavement, Egypt, to the promised land. And God moves with you through time and history, and you're co creating with God the future. And then what you get is you get in Christianity the drawing together of these two into a very powerful worldview that gives you an integrated account of the vertical and the horizontal. And I talk about that giving you sort of the three orders you need in your worldview. It gives you a nomological order. It tells you the rules by which reality runs. It gives you a narrative order. It tells you the story you belong to. And it gives you a normative order. It tells you how you can ascend the vertical. And it does this all beautifully and integrated and really well structured. And then what happens, late Middle Ages, that starts to fall apart. That starts to fall apart in a lot of important ways. And one of the reasons why it starts to fall, well, there's two interlocking reasons. One is sort of the knowing side. What happens is there's increasing changing in reading, and eventually the accessibility of easier text, and eventually there's going to be the printing press, but that whole thing is taking off much earlier, and you get the movement of knowing to what I call a reduction to propositional tyranny, that all the non-propositional kinds of knowing emphasized in Greece. So in addition to dianoia, discursive knowing, you have noesis, right? You have techne, which is procedural knowing. You have noesis, which is perspectival, and you have gnosis, which is this participatory knowing. All of those get lost, and what happens is you get a retraction of knowing to propositions. And what knowing is to get a coherence in the proposition that somehow corresponds to reality. And then you get the rise of nominalism and the idea that we're now observing reality and naming it from a distance. And you get this radical disconnect.
yeah,
And at the same time that's happening, the two worlds mythology is getting reified and even ossified into the natural world that is accessible by reason and science, and the supernatural world that is completely inaccessible to reason and science and is only accessible by faith, where faith now means this kind of asserting things without evidence. And what happens with that is you get, and the two reinforce each other, but I won't go in. But what happens is you get radical disconnection. All these
yeah,
disconnections start
yeah,
to form.
yeah,
Eventually the upper world becomes absurd to people, and then you
yeah,
get a very deep problem, because people had been educated that this world was the schoolhouse for how we got to that world. it
yeah,
doesn't have it doesn't have any inherent value. But if you
yeah,
lose the
yeah,
upper world, right, the
yeah,
lower
yeah,
world, this is Nietzsche's point. So you get that, and then as we get more and more locked into if you come to think that there are no real patterns or relations out there, right, it's all in here. you move very rapidly into Descartes' dualism, where there's the completely immaterial mind stuff in here, completely separate. And I know Bernardo differ on this on some degree, but I'm just making a historical point here,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
You get Descartes' dualism, which gives you a radical disconnect between mind and body, radical disconnect between you and other minds, radical disconnect between you and the world, radical skepticism, radical solipsism. You've lost the sacred canopy. The church is now in turmoil because of the Reformation. And then there's the bloody civil war between the Catholics and the Protestants. And people say, let's put religion out of the center stage of our lives. You get the emergence of the secular world, the secular state, and it's within a Cartesian scientific framework. And then you have the meaning crisis, because what you have is a worldview that purports to explain everything except how you, as a meaning maker, actually belong in that world as somebody who pursues meaning and truth and can do science. So you have the problem that we generate this worldview from which we are radically alienated, radically disconnected.
Yeah, it's very nice how you. This is so beautiful how you sketch that meta arc in just a couple of minutes, and there's a lot in there. I thought when you said sort of that disconnect, that sort of the first, the yeah, I think you must have treated the Hume's work also, right? And I just hearing you talk remembered this quote by David Hume. Sort of he was the father of empiricism, right? That he says something like, if anything, if there's no sort of hardcore empirical way to test stuff, committed to the flames. So it's this war against, right? And
Can I say something about that?
yeah,
Because
sure.
what he actually says is he says if you can't show it by deductive logic or by empirical evidence, committed to the flames. And what he's doing is he's also doing this radical separation between reason, which is getting reduced to computation, and all of the affective embodied aspects of our existence, the sensory empirical world. And even those two are getting pulled apart and dichotomized from each other. It's
Yeah, and whereas I think some of those, I mean, weren't sort of someone like Newton was also into alchemy, right? So he had sort of they were still in that era where both they could hold sort of both positions, right? Would you agree?
I think, I mean, I have a very ambivalent relationship to Newton. I agree with you that Newton is doing both things. It's not clear to me that Newton was seeking any kind of deep reconciliation between them. And the way I think he thought he was doing things. He thought he could use sort of mathematical principles to turn the Bible into sort of an alphabetic code that he can convert into a numerical sequence, and he could sort of calculate the end of the world. And of course, all those calculations came to naught, and the interpretations are largely rejected by almost all biblical scholars. So I maybe he thought he was trying to integrate him, but maybe this is the most charitable way to say it. The integration is where his genius left him. There's no genius in his integration attempts. I think there was still a desire to have that fundamental connectedness, and that's why he's pursuing alchemy, why he's so invested in these theological endeavors. But he there's no legacy to his I think very insufficient attempts at the integration.
But that nice to hear that from you, because I'm not that into this. But would you say that um, the both worlds were still held sort of intellectually, I suppose, in sort of the early Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, and then we have in the 19th century when we get to sort of the metaphysics of physicalism and materialism. It seems as if people somehow forget about metaphysics altogether. At least that's sort of my analysis in sort of reading and thinking about all of this. And how would you describe that development, sort of just this awareness of metaphysics and the shift made that led perhaps to the meaning crisis, and then now sort of where we are at, well, now of course we have see a renaissance, I think, again of metaphysics, but I mean for 50 or 100 years, it seemed as if materialism was just reigning and metaphysics wasn't even sort of thought of in academia.
Yeah, and I think this is important to trace this out. It's so part of what's happening is, yeah, there's the upper world, but think about how absent God is from Shakespeare, right? And that's in this, and that's in the time of Newton, right? Before Newton, I should say. And so God is largely absent. The supernatural's there, but it's very like absurd in the sense of we don't know what it is, and it's always negative and always terrifying, right? And you got that sort of sense. So the upper world is already becoming absurd, and then what's happening uh, around that is Kant basically comes along and says, you know what? I'm going to argue that there's a deep reason why that's absurd. We can't, the mind is incapable of building any kind of metaphysics. And so whenever we do this, right, we're going to end up with something that's actually, in a deep philosophical sense, absurd, doesn't make any sense. And so with Kant, you get what starts with Occam and Hume, right? And you get this locking in, and and you sorry the pun there, but it's even in Locke, Locke's model of we're sort of like inside a dark cabinet somewhere, and we're getting postcards from the world, and we're trying to sort of assemble them and reason as to what the outside world is, and Kant just takes all of that and locks it in. And what's happened, and this is still the case within a lot of academia, many people take the Kantian critique of transcendence and how it gets ramified and developed by Hegel um, as kind of a finished thing. We're like the idea that there's a transcendent, that there is a metaphysical way of thinking that gives us some appropriate contact with kinds of reality that we can't get within sort of the bounds of our phenomenological experience. Many philosophers take that for granted. And Kant properly argued, I mean, I don't agree with his argument, but I think what he was doing made sense. That's what I mean, that this was actually the philosophical implication of the Newtonian world, that the Newtonian world is a closed world and we're locked in, and all we can talk about, right, is that, and we are locked into the finitude. And so you get a worldview in which we're locked into a particular arena, and our cognitive agency is locked in, and we're, but the maddening thing about it is we're locked out from each other. I mean,
Yeah,
Kant has the thing in itself,
yeah,
which is what reality, and it's completely unknowable to us and things like that.
yeah. But he at least doesn't sort of ontologically deny this transcendent reality, right? It's sort of an epistemic that we just cannot know it. We're locked in that sense, or is it
Yeah,
different?
yeah. No, I think that's right. But his arguments are his, well, his arguments are famously difficult to read as convincing arguments. I mean, like a standard argument from Kant is, well, I can't give you any argument that would license an ontological conclusion, but notice that we have this moral drive, and the only way we could actually satisfy it is if we were immortal, because if we're finite, but odd implies can. So how can there be an odd on us if we can't realize it? So we must be immortal. And you sort of look like that and say, I don't think odd implies, absolute can. It only means can, in the situation. Does morality presuppose perfection? There's a lot of moral systems, and that's what happened. I don't want to
Mm,
go through it because that's what
yeah,
happened. People
yeah.
just basically they're not convinced by these 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 sort of pietistic arguments, these arguments that sort of go from our moral intuitions and other things, and try to say, oh well, I can't give you any argument to I can't give you any reason to believe that, but you can believe it because of this. And it's like,
Mm.
well, either that's a reason or it's not, and so on.
Yeah. Wouldn't you say that in that sense we live in interesting times, right? Because even your own work, the mind body problem, and talking about metaphysics, talking about consciousness, we live in the age of computation and we live in the age of sort of AI, right? And now sort of these questions become relevant because they might even become technologically relevant to us. So what are your thoughts there? Um,
I mean, I think I think one of the things that's been happening, and the two I would most I think many philosophers would agree with me. The two greatest philosophers of the 20th century are Wittgenstein and Heidegger, and what you see is and they both start the two big schools. Wittgenstein is the analytic tradition, Russell, right? But Wittgenstein really gets it going, and then there's Heidegger in the continental tradition, and what both of those traditions slowly come to from completely independent angles. And I think actually recovering the deep impetus given to them by both Wittgenstein and Heidegger was an attempt to just not an attempt not to resolve the Cartesian problem, but to somehow just break out of that grammar, the mind, body, right, the subjective, objective, all, and just and break it. And so like Catherine Pickstock in her wonderful book, Access of Truth, says, look what's happened. All of the big distinctions that were supposed to keep us, locked into the Cartesian world, the analytic synthetic distinction of Kant, that is broken down under Quine's argument. The fact value distinction or the is odd of Hume, well, that is broken down under Casebeer and Putnam. And I can do all, and what you can see is the analytic tradition has just sort of, destroyed all of the things that were supposed to keep us sort of happily in that model. And then on the other side, you've got the phenomenological tradition doing what's been called the theological turn in phenomenology, which is trying to get away from, I'm going to use as neutral a term as I can here,
Mm-hmm.
Hans, but trying to get away from the sacredness within our phenomenology is a
Mm.
doomed project. Somehow the sacred is a given in our phenomenology, the way other aspects of our phenomenology are present to us. And so you've got the theological turn in the continental tradition, and you have the analytic tradition basically destroying all of the distinctions and the whole conceptual schema that supported that whole Cartesian worldview.
There's a lot here, and I've been trying to get my head around. I'm studying sort of quantum mechanics for the Essential Foundation because Bernard we're very much about sort of that analytic approach and trying to see what the foundations of physics are saying. And that's not, of course, not your field of expertise, but what I find super interesting when I hear you talk about these two philosophical camps arriving at this, and then we have, of course, sort of the stunning revolution in physics with quantum theory that sort of also messes with the objective and the subjective. And I even came across this term, I think it's one of the students from Wheeler, John Wheeler, who said we live in a sort of epiontic. He merges sort of the epistemic and the ontic of quantum. So we are now, that's just super fascinating. But then you get to sort of a monism, right? And is it, would you say that's sort of from that
I think that's right. I would also just add to your thing about how the quantum, of course, relativity also challenges absolute space and time, right? And it puts you into a relational ontology as
Yeah.
opposed to a substance ontology. And of course, the same thing is happening at quantum. We're getting, if the current proposal that space-time is itself emergent from entanglement, then you have pure relationality at the bottom and pure relationality at the top, and we're seeking the relation between them. And this just undermines the whole substance ontology and the subject predicate logic in profound ways. And what I think that does is I think that also significantly undermines sort of a reductionist strategy,
Yeah.
a sort of that everything above the bottom level is somehow illusory or not real. And there's a whole bunch of arguments I've marshaled to advance that, and other
Mm.
people like my friend Evan Thompson and the Blind Spot is doing it. So a lot again, there's now this emerging thing where like no, this attempt to get a single level flat ontology isn't isn't viable. You have Wolfgang Smith and in from quantum mechanics, the measurement problem. You need at least two levels in your reality to have measurement. And as soon as you admit the
Mm.
possibility of two levels, reductionism is done. It's just done. It's finished,
Mm.
right? And so, and for me, that's important, Hans, because that means we have, after this long loss of the supernatural, which I'm kind of glad it's gone. I'm not trying to bring it back, but as we lost that, we lost the vertical. And now what's happening is the recovery of the vertical. We're
Mm.
realizing that we are not just historical political beings, but we're recovering that we participate ontologically in a vertical fashion, what Plato and the Neoplatonists were talking about.
Yeah, yeah.
And that to me is very, very significant.
And where would you sort of, and it's always a bit sort of a trick question, but I ask it a lot to people just to sort of, I see the spectrum, right, where physicalism and materialism is one position, and of course, sort of the hardcore idealist position I see. I always notice that people don't want to commit to either one of them, which I can understand. And then we have this position of panpsychism. Maybe first, what do you think of this spectrum I'm sketching here? And if you think it is sort of a continuum or spectrum that is, where would you point yourself at?
Yeah, and I want to be really, really careful here, because I'll be on. Of course, I'll be honest with you, Hans. I'll give what I think are my best arguments and my best take. But I mean, I think next to God, consciousness is the hardest problem, right? And so I fully suspect that even though I'll give what I think is my best take, it will probably not too far from now be shown to be in some important way incorrect. And I think everybody, and this is one of the things I liked about our discussion with Bernardo. We disagreed, but we both recognized the value of the other person's perspective. There was genuine epistemic humility. There was genuine
Yeah.
commitment. And that's why I said I'd be happy to talk with him again. I think there's a plan for me and him to talk again at some point soon.
Oh, great. You should. Because also, I think we're committed to sort of the same, in the end, the same mission. If I read sort of the Essentia Foundation is very much about, in the end, we're about science, right, and metaphysics, but it has this cultural aspect that we see sort of what sort of this reductionist, sort of naive materialism, to say it that way,
Yeah.
does to society. And because I think you would agree, right, that is a very sort of very at the root of the meaning crisis, in a sense, that turn.
Totally.
Yeah.
I think so. So I'm okay with the spectrum. I like to make it a little bit more epistemic, ontic, in some way.
Yeah.
So I okay. So I describe myself, and Greg Enriquez and I are we've argued this, and we're writing a book on consciousness. I argue for what I call transcendent naturalism. So naturalism is not phys. So naturalism is first of all not reductive physicalism. Naturalism embraces a multi-leveled ontology, and it's not just emergence up, because if it's just emergence up, the upper levels are epiphenomenal. It's emergence up and emanation down. It's very much a Neoplatonic kind of model. And then the idea in that is, well, what does that mean epistemologically? Well, what that means epistemologically is don't just derive your ontology from your sciences, your natural sciences. You also have to derive your ontology by what's presupposed by your natural sciences, right? Not just what's derived from them, but what's presupposed by them. Well, there's intelligibility. Well, if you give me that there's intelligibility, then I can unpack the Neoplatonic worldview. And if you agree that the representational theory of knowledge is being significantly undermined, then our relationship to these levels of self and world is not just representational, it's actually participatory. We can participate in strong transcendence, not just sort of psychological improvement or representing the world better. We can actually, as Plotinus would say, we can become more at one with the one, right? But the one isn't like, even though I'm gesturing upward, it isn't a supernatural. It's as much at the bottom coming up
Yeah.
as it is from the top, and it completely
Yeah.
interpenetrates. So there's a polarity of where, for me, ultimate reality, and this is how you combine intelligibility to being by thinking of reality. And this is the work of James Filler and others, that reality is ultimately relationality, not a substance. And so that's where I sort of, that's my stance. The sort of transcendent naturalism that rejects a substance ontology, has a purely relational ontology. And then what that means, again, is a sense of, ultimately a participatory epistemology, transformative in powerful ways. And this leads to the place where you can both epistemologically, and a lot of my work does this, and ontologically home experiences, realizations of non-duality,
Yeah,
which
yeah. Mm,
and for me that's I think any good theory needs to do that. I
yeah,
think the cross-cultural, cross-historical report we get from people, and I've experienced these
yeah,
too, is that these are the really real. And if my theory of knowledge and reality can't home these experiences of the really real, I take it that it's failed. So that's one of my touchstones. Can this worldview, can it not only play well with science, but can it play well with non-duality and non-dual transformation? So that's what I've attempted.
yeah. Beautiful. And I like that word strong transcendence. What it triggers when I hear you speak about phenomenology, I a couple of thoughts here. I'm super curious what you think. Do you know the work of Jeffrey Kripal? The who has
I've met him. I met him, and we didn't get a chance to talk very much. He complimented me on a comment I made. We were both at a conference together at Harvard on Platonism as a living tradition. So
check. I'll briefly sketch why I mention him because he's written this book called The Superhumanity. So he's really all about that we have to make this ontological flip, how he calls it. He's also written a book, The Flip. I wouldn't say he calls himself a dual aspect monist. Um, but he pointed me that book I found very very interesting because he pointed to sort of the fact that we have two William Jameses. We have the pragmatist, and but we also have the William James who was really into perhaps strong transcendence. And
yes,
we have the Nietzsche, the nihilist. We also have the Nietzsche, the Übermensch, which you could read like just instrumental and not as if he was talking about something really transcendent. And Kripal is saying, no, we need to acknowledge the fact that these thinkers were actually invoking a real ontology beyond sort of just our phenomenological explanations. And I see now, I see this happening in the psychedelic research community. I've visited conferences here in the Netherlands, and it's a very interesting debate because here we have people coming back, meeting God, oneness, you name it, of course, in the psychedelic
yeah.
experiences. And then, of course, the research community is, okay, how do we need to guide these people metaphysically, right? And we're going to just say, okay, that was your experience. And so we see now this metaphysical debate becoming really interesting. And I saw that the mainstream of psychedelic research wants to stay in a sort of safe phenomenology, saying, oh, it's just your experience, and we don't need to say anything. Just very interested what your analysis is of what's happening right now.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, there's a group of people that are very interested in my work, because of its potentials to give, what they take. I'm trying to not be self-congratulatory here. They take it to be a better framework than that safe sort of medicalized materialism,
Yeah,
that they're, yeah. And so the thing is, like, and Hans, everything I'm talking to you about, and it's completely appropriate to talk about it in this philosophical, phenomenological, ontological language, but it also connects up with a lot of the nuts and bolts work I do on, predictive processing, embodiment, relevance realization. So, like, I I I believe, I think I have good evidence to believe that I can science with the best of the sciences, and so that's what's attractive, uh, I believe,
yeah,
to right. That people can say, well, look, John does this work, and it's really, theoretically powerful. That's what I'm told, and it really, and we just got a paper published on, naturalizing relevance realization in Frontiers of Neuroscience, I believe, or psychology, can't remember which one. And uh, it can get into the scientific arena, and do the sparring really well, but it also, like I said, is open to a much stronger reading of these transcendent and transformative states. And many people in the research community, they're good researchers. They want to be honest to what they're the data they're getting. People don't agree when you say to them, well, we think you're just sort of, they go, well, that's kind of interesting, but for me it was blah. Right. Right.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so um, sorry, Hans, this is difficult for me because I'm sounding, I don't want to come across as self-congratulatory, but I'm trying to explain why, right? Why I think there has been increasing interest from the psychedelic community, the psychedelic predictive processing community about my work, precisely because it affords a potential bridging and a well-argued, well-evidenced way out of a merely medical materialist ontology.
Yeah, and I think you're doing exactly the same for sort of the mindfulness community and people who are sensing that in these practices there is also something deeper than just sort of the functional
Yeah.
way that it can make you more relaxed, or sort of the Mac mindfulness
Yeah.
critique, right?
Yeah.
Because how do you regard that? The whole project of seeing, okay, yes, we have this meaning crisis. We need more meaning in our lives. Okay, let's look at these traditions that somehow give people that, but we don't want that difficult, weird ontology they're talking. Just do the practices. And that's interesting because you see that now. I think also, don't you think that sort of the whole Stoicism movement, yeah, it's called Mac mindfulness. You have all these practices, and people are doing it en masse right now. But um, it's as if you want to keep the ontology out a bit and just.
Well, so I have a deep critique of that. I have a very deep and standing critique of that. I mean, I have the individual published critique of that um, mistransposition from a Buddhist or a Vedantist framework into sort of Western consumer capitalism and a technique so that you will feel comfortable with being a corporate drone or something like that. I like I reject that, but I want to make it a more broader criticism, which is this idea that you can, again, that you can just make something a technique is missing the point. Human beings, there's formal arguments for this, no free lunch theorem, bias variance. I won't go into this. There is no panacea practice. There's no simple thing you can do that will alleviate all the ways in which human beings fall into self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior, become alienated, experience absurdity, get overwhelmed by existential anxiety. Like, there's nothing. So if you put your seated mindfulness practice back in situ, you'll see that it's part of a whole ecology of practices like the Eightfold Path. And what you have is this very complex living system that is dealing with the complexity of human cognition and being in the world and addressing it in this highly dynamically parallel fashion. And then you can't just have that hanging out there in limbo. An ecology of practices needs a homing worldview that legitimates it and properly authorizes people to be teachers and guides. And that's what the religions used to do. I'm not advocating for religion here, but you can't just say, you know what I'll do is I'll take it out of all of that and I'll plug it in over here and it'll continue to work. And that's just profound self-deception. That's just profound self. And here's the thing, Hans, that actually exacerbates the meaning crisis because it keeps you locked in to the very mindset that is driving the meaning crisis.
Wow, uh, depth here, and you point to the necessity of religion that we need it, right? I've heard you say that also in relation to AI and where things are heading, and that we need. Could you elaborate a bit on that? Why we exactly in this day and age, in the age of AI, things now going so fast, and we're about to get more alienated. Why we need religion and how we can get there, because that's of course a difficult question.
So I would, yes, and this is always fraught for me, because as soon as as soon as I used to say we need the religion that's not a religion, and if you want, I'll tell you why. Now I don't use that term. There was a misframing of the issue in my understanding it that way. But what I was the virtuous part of that sort of deep mistake was that I was trying to get at when I say like we need something like a religion, we need an ecology of practices. We need a mythological, right, not right worldview that homes that and orients us and puts us into the right relationship with the right people at the right time for right development and things like that. The meta virtue of maturation is just facing up to reality. So when I say that, people automatically hear either one religion, Christianity, or they hear the Abrahamic notion of what religion is. Religion is the worship of a supernatural super being, super thing. And of course, I don't mean that. They think, well, maybe John just means the legacy religions from the Axial age, like also Buddhism and Taoism. Well, I want to include the non-theisms, but I don't mean just that either. Uh, I, I mean, there's a fellow Canadian, Schellenberg, he's talked about how here's a very reasonable proposal. He says, we are probably spiritually immature. We've only been doing spirituality for maybe maximally 40,000 years. We've existed as even Homo sapiens for 200,000 years. And then there's been, there's been something like the Homo genus for 4 million years, right? And then you put that against how long there's been life and how long, and it's like, oh, but we got it. We've got ultimate reality nailed down. And it's like, well, I don't think so. So when I'm talking about that, what I'm talking about is we need something like what religion did, but we need it to be responsive to and responsible to what I think is happening right now. And I think Bernardo is an instance of this. And I think and you're talking to many people in many places. There is a bottom up, and it's not just popular. There's also intellectuals involved, artists, but there's an advent of the sacred taking place now. There's like the sacred wants to come into prominence for us in order to give us what we need to deeply address the meaning crisis. But it's almost like we need to find, we need to, I'll pun on this. We need to come to terms. We need to come up with the right terms, but we need to come to terms with it. And so I now talk about the philosophical Silk Road, and it's the name of my next big series, because I'm saying, well, now what we need to do is sort of journey through all of the religions, see if we can find a through line. And that's not the answer. That is the thing that can make us best, like best attending on, waiting for, and capable of receiving and appreciating the answer as it is emerging for us. That's how I talk now.
Mm, and beautiful. And you, when you say the sacred ones, good maybe to define the sacred. What I know that's
Yes,
the sort of
I want to. And eventually, and I'm going to ask you to eventually at some point bring me back to why I say theology is the
Mhm.
discipline for the future for AI. But let's answer that question because I think it's very important. Here again, I think Schellenberg is very helpful and it's convergent from a lot of other things. So there's there's sort of there's the three T's, the triple transcendent. So the sacred is something that is ultimately real, it's ultimately transformative, and it's ultimately normative. It not only transforms you, it guides you. So it's ultimately real, it's ultimately transformative, and it's ultimately normative. And then you ask yourself these two questions. This is also deeply influenced by his work. You ask yourself, well, what is the best stance I should take towards the sacred? He says we're immature, so we shouldn't be trying to draw conclusions. We should seek to mature. And so imagine a child that was convinced they knew it all. Well, we've met children like that and they're little demons, right? And so uh, he says, he argues, well, what you have to think about is two things. How thick do you want your description of the transcendent to be? Thick meaning you're trying to fill it in because you're trying to get completeness and closure and conclusion.
Yeah.
Or you want a thin description because a thin description gives you enough so you're not just, I don't know what we're doing, but just enough to orient you so you can develop and grow up and mature. And then he says, now you can have a thin or a thick description, and you can have a weak or a strong sense of the transcendent, the sacred. Weak would be no T's, then weak would a little less weak would be one T, and then as you add more T's, you get a stronger sense of the transcendent. And then this is the argument to make, I've made convergent arguments, so I'm very much aligned with it. If we are oriented from the stance of the recognition of our spiritual maturity and we're trying to mature, we should have a thin description, but we should orient towards a strong transcendence because that is the relationship that has the greatest potential to transform us, grow us up, develop us, mature us. So we should have a thin description of a strong transcendence. And
Yeah.
then if
Yeah.
you'll allow me, if you'll allow
Yeah,
me,
sure. Yeah, yeah, please.
here's a move I make. He doesn't make this move. I make this move. So I'm not trying to take credit. I'm trying to say this is not something he says.
And just
I
sorry,
said
his name again because I that went a bit too fast. The you're
Schellenberg,
referring.
Schellenberg, Evolutionary Religion, Religion After Science. Two great
Thanks.
books.
Please continue. Yeah.
So let's call theism. Now these terms are wishy-washy, but in order to be clear about what we're talking about, let's call theism the proposal of thick, strong. You want a thick description of strong transcendence. And then he says, let's call atheism a refusal of strong transcendence. There is no strong transcendence. Okay. I propose to you that non-theism rejects the weak transcendence of atheism and the thick description of theism. Non-theism is the thin, strong option, and it is the one that is most appropriate for affording us to grow into and mature towards and afford the advent of the sacred. That's the argument I wanted to make.
That's a strong argument. I find it very compelling. But I mean, I should all, I want to say critical in this interview, but this I just find very compelling. Two things it reminds me of reading in Zombies in Western Culture. You made clear to me that I think you said that after Luther, sort of the Reformation in Christianity, that sacredness and spirituality became abstract, and that I found a very interesting insight. Could you say that the description became thick? You know, I'm sort of brought up in this Dutch Reformed tradition. It's sola fide. It's just about believing and the doctrines, and actually it wants to downplay your longing for that strong transcendence because it puts all emphasis on blessed are those that believe without seeing, right? And then I'm like, and this I'm, but please reflect on what I'm saying. When I go to sort of, I've had my own psychedelic experiences and listening a lot to Terence McKenna, Ramdas, sort of all the sort of the pioneers in that field. There's this approach. Okay, I want exactly what you're saying. I want a thin description. Just tell me what the substance is and what the ceremony is, and I'll do it. And then I want that strong experience, and that's exactly what it gives them. And I'm now seeing there's a renaissance in psychedelics, but are different, and shamanism and all sorts of tradition. So isn't it happening, John? And isn't it sort of that?
I think so. I think the advent of the sacred. I think the psychedelic renaissance is part of the advent of the sacred. I think for all of the ways in which they can go awry, the return to shamanism, the attempt to bring back stoicism, and I take all your criticism seriously. I'm not putting them aside, but there's something driving that is what I'm trying to get at, and I think this is about. People's desire to address the meaning crisis and an understanding that, simply getting more stuff or accumulating political power or having your side win in the culture war or just sort of affirming some comprehensive scientific theoretical propositions, none of that cuts it. None of that does it for you. And then to know that that's, well, because I can hear a sort of the village atheist saying, well, you're just making an argument for hope. No, I'm not. I'm saying that position from which you're making your reductive claims is actually not epistemologically and ontologically viable. So it's not just, well, wouldn't it be nice if there was meaning? It's no. If you have a worldview in which meaning is not deeply possible for you, that just puts you into this profound performative contradiction. It undermines your scientific endeavors, etc. So,
and
but I do think, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. How do you think we can avoid, if we look back in history, like 50 years ago, we had the first sort of psychedelic that wasn't a renaissance, but sort of the when it really took off, right, in the 60s, and the whole psychedelic culture. Then we see sort of the new age culture coming out of that, and I think all those people who tripped in the 60s became, they bought houses and became materialists, etc. What culture do we need now to sort of make sure that sort of this doesn't end up the same way? Because nowadays there's also this critique of spiritual bypassing, spiritual materialism, and I also can I see it in the, if I look in the mirror, John, I see myself doing it in a way. I see myself how easy you get there. I mean, we have YouTube. I can watch YouTube videos. I listen to one of you, and then I go to a more sort of esoteric stuff, which I like as a sort of a hobby of self help. And I'm doing fine here in the West. I have a house, and my life's beautiful. But I'm not changing the world, or at least not, perhaps not as much as I could do.
So, I mean, well, one thing I would say is, a thin description doesn't mean an impoverished ecology of practices, and Schellenberg also makes this clear. No, you need a rich ecology of practices. That's why you, in fact, have a thin description because you're making bloody space in your mind and your life for practices, right, that transform you at all these levels from the physiological up to higher states of consciousness, and also not just you, but all of your relationality, all your ways you relate to other people, etc. So a thin description is actually deeply consonant with a very richly developed ecology of practices. Because the reason why you're having the thin description is because you are trying to not close, not come to conclusion, but open yourself up to the best possible development, which means you need a rich ecology of practices. And the problem in the 60s is there wasn't that. What you had was you had the drugs, the Beatles, and kind of a regurgitated romanticism and kind of beat Buddhism, which is a romantic misunderstanding of Buddhism. I think Kerouac, I have a lot of criticisms of Kerouac around that, things like that. And so I think part of what why it failed is exactly what we're talking about now. We need these practices. Don't I'll say this: don't take a psychedelic substance unless you already have a good running ecology of practices, because if you're not doing something to significantly at many levels address your capacities for self-deception, you're well, nobody gets addicted to psychedelics. No, they get addicted to rabbit hole metaphysics. That's what happens out of these things, right? And so you want, right, and what they end up with is their own idiosyncratic, completely egocentric, thick description. If you want to keep a proper thin description, you need a rich ecology of practices, and you need to be, right, constantly, right, balancing off the experience with your cultivation of wisdom and rational and wise self-reflection, individually and collectively. um, and that wasn't done, and I think that's a profound mistake. And so part of my concern, and I should tell you that many of the people that I talk with, the circles I move within the psychedelic world, they're concerned about that too. For example, let me just give you one concrete example. So the media constantly reports on the power of psychedelics, and that's misinformation in an important way, because it is the combination almost always of psychedelics and a therapeutic framework that brings about the results. It's not just the experience. There's a sapiential framework. It's not monological, it's dialogical, and it's designed to bring about transformation. And it's only within that framework that you're getting these results that you're getting. And see, that's what I mean. You have to like put it put it into a proper framework.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot I want to sort of follow up on, but maybe good to also respect your time to dive a bit more in sort of the before I get back to sort of stuff like this. The analytic a question I had, sort of the very interesting like three-phase rocket you propose of intelligence, rationality, wisdom.
Yeah.
Could you briefly sketch that model? And also following up, sort of additional to that question, sort of that model, then how relevance realization plays into that, and
Yes.
to what degree are these levels computational?
Okay.
Sorry. Okay.
Easy question. So I propose, in fact, I've just recorded a course for the Peterson Academy. I propose that general intelligence. So, first of all, the phenomena of general intelligence, which is people are invoking with AGI. Well, you should go back and pay what's meant by general intelligence. Well, Spearman talked about this, the fact that how you do in any one test from multiple domains strongly predicts on how you do on all the other tests. There's a strong positive manifold. There's plausibly some general factor at work. And of course, there's endless debates about what that is. What I would argue the evidence and the argument is converging towards, even though a lot of people would disagree about this with me, but I think I do continue to make a strong case on this, I believe, is that what general intelligence is, it's the solving of two meta problems. Meta problems are problems you have to solve whenever you're trying to solve some specific problem. And there's two meta problems. The two things that will make you more adaptive. One is, how anticipatory are you? This is like Michael Levin's idea of the cognitive light cone. Like, think about how you judge your dog more intelligent than a cat, because you can see the dog anticipating more deeply into the world than the cat. And why? Because when I can anticipate things from a long way away, my chances of solving them goes up exponentially, right? So now, but here's the thing, and these are two interlocking. As soon as I start to anticipate the world, I face this problem that the amount of information I have to consult is going up exponentially, and it very quickly becomes combinatorially explosive. All of the things I could pay attention to and all the possible combination patterns of attention, all the things that I could remember, all the possibilities I consider, all the sequences of action. And what you do, and you're doing it right now, is you somehow quickly grab what's relevant from long-term memory, a couple combinations, what's relevant to pay attention to, a couple combinations, relevant things, you're nodding your head, right? And you're doing it like that. You're doing it like that, right? And that's what I call relevance realization. And I mean both senses of the word. You are becoming aware of something, that one sense of realization, but also reality is grabbing you in a way. There's
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
realization.
It's, and to make it concrete, in my own personal life, I've had this. That's just what comes up when you say this. I had this. I had an aquarium and I had a fish jumping out. I'd never had that problem, and it wasn't, the fish net was away, and it was like, and I know if I'm gonna take it, it was like a very small fish, I'll damage it. So I was like, okay, and I went to the drawer in the kitchen, I saw a straw, and I cut it open, and I had fixed, like in no time, I had the solution. It's like crazy if you think about it, right? Isn't this it, right? That out of all the, I have this problem, and of all the, and then I just see what's relevant, and I combine stuff, and I do something new that's never been done. To me, that's what it triggers, right? And that, and this, the question then is, can we arrive at this algorithmically? Can we arrive at this computationally?
So I'm going to answer that question in a sec, but I want to pick up on what your example shows. That's a moment of insight you had. You went, oh, aha, and you reframed how you saw the problem. You reformulated. And that tells you something else about relevance realization. It has this recursive aspect to it. One of the things that relevance realization is doing is trying to realize if the framing is itself relevant, right? So you're doing this zeroing in, you're framing the world because you can't pay attention to everything. But what you do, you've also got something going that's constantly probing the possibility that that frame might be actually causing you to mistake or miss the solution. And when you have a moment of insight, now, that's important because that says that even within your intelligence, there is this requirement of recursivity. Well, why? Because when I do this relevance realization, I'm ignoring so much information. And the chances that I might be deceiving myself and missing what really matters, that what I find salient might actually not be relevant to solving my problem, right? This is a perennial problem we face. Now, you can't say, well, what I'll do is examine all the information. That's impossible. So what you need is you need strategies that allow you to ameliorate your self-deception, make that self-correction more flexible, make yourself more prone to insight, but not jumping to conclusion, because that's a problem too. So you have to do, so you see what I'm doing with my hands? You need this ecology of practices that will deal with this really dynamic, massively recursive, potentially self-deceptive, but massively adaptive ability. That's rationality. That's right. Rationality is how you deal with the self-deception that inevitably emerges when you use your general intelligence.
Yeah, and it's higher up than intelligence, right? Because it's
Yeah.
reflecting on intelligence itself,
Yes,
in a
exactly.
sense. Yeah.
Yes. Now,
And then we
back,
have the wisdom. Wisdom, what's the step
what's
up then
wisdom?
to wisdom? Yeah.
Okay. So wisdom goes towards this idea that I've already alluded to when I talked about propositional tyranny, that you have other kinds of knowing other than propositional knowing. You have procedural know-how, and that's not stored in beliefs, it's stored in skills. And it doesn't give you a sense of truth, it gives you a sense of power. But your sense of power is also a way you sense reality. You've got your perspectival knowing, your noetic awareness. Right? This is knowing by noticing. This is what's it like to be you here right now, noticing what you're noticing. That's perspectival knowing, and that's stored in episodic memory, where you remember living through an episode from a particular perspective, and then that's grounded in participatory knowing. How are you coupled to the world so that relevance realization is continuing to happen? How are you cognitively, adaptively fitted to the world so that you and the world fit together and there's an agent arena relationship and there are affordances? So you get the participatory coupling gives you affordances. The perspectival knowing if it's working right notices the relevant affordances. You bring that now gives you a script for your acting out your skills, and as you act out your skills, you gain evidence whereby you form your beliefs. If that makes sense to you, and I have a lot of argument for that, but if that makes sense to you, you have to think, oh, but wait, each kind of knowing has its own different way of falling into self-deception. And what I need, right, is I need not only a rationality of inference, but also a rationality of skill, a rationality of insight, a rationality of identification. Are you taking up the right role in it right now? Think about when we talk about a reasonable person. We don't just mean they run an argument in their head. We mean they notice what they should notice and they take on the appropriate role they should take on, right? So if there's a possibility of self-deception, you not only need a rationality for each kind of knowing, you need a meta-rationality that coordinates them together. That's
Mm.
wisdom. That's my proposal.
Ah, interesting. And the question then is how to code that. How does this relate to the sort of more or less classic example in AI and ethical AI, that when you would want a sort of a strong intelligence, just say, okay, buy me a cup of coffee, and there's no coffee around, and it starts killing people to get, sort of that classic example, because
Yeah,
it
yeah,
doesn't have
the
to.
alignment problem. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, a sort of ontological point, and then a scientific point, and then we'll come back to this proper ethical point. The ontological point, and this was the point of the paper we just got published, is we argue, Johannes Jaeger, Alex Jovanovic, Anna Riedel, two students of mine, and Dennis Walsh, a colleague of mine at the University of Toronto. We argue that relevance realization is not computational, cannot be computational in nature. And that has to do with a very developed argument. I'll just sort of give the gist of it. So I understand the form I give won't be sort of deductively valid, but the idea is, okay, so any attempt to come up with a rule. Okay, so if I'm going to apply a rule like be kind, this is a classic argument, even going back to Aristotle. So I can't specify in the rule the conditions of the application of the rule. Like being kind to my son is very different from how I'm being kind to my romantic partner, which is very different from how I'm being kind to you. And if I was kind to you the way I'm being kind to my son, that's creepy and weird. If I'm kind to you the way I'm kind to my romantic partner, that's extra creepy and extra weird. And then what you can't do is say, well, what I'll do is I'll make rules for all the conditions of applications, right? And Wittgenstein famously said, no, this has to give way to something that is not rule governed. That's the first point. Logical relations, implication. So the logical implications of a proposition are constant, and they are combinatorially explosive in number. This is a point made by Jerry Fodor. So here's a proposition: tomorrow will be windy. All of the possible implications of that are there, and that's constant. That's its logical identity. But its relevance changes. It like that the relevance of that changes if I'm staying in and watching movies, if I'm going out and I'm going skydiving, if I'm flying a kite, if I'm going out for a picnic, right? Do you see what I'm saying? And this was Fodor's point. The relevance is constantly shifting. The logical implication identity is constant. So you can't capture the relevance in the logical implications. In fact, I would argue that that's what inference is. Inference is selecting which implication happens to be relevant to your problem. So you can't capture it with inferential logical, you can't capture it with implication relations. You can't capture it with rules. Any attempt to create a formal system is itself an ill-defined problem. So there's a technical way of putting this, but let me give you an anecdote, okay? An anecdote for this. So when I was taking logic in undergrad, first you're spending a lot of time just figuring out how to use the logical system. And then you get sort of good at that, and then you're still not getting great marks. And you realize because what you're failing on is your translation of natural language into the logical system. And then you realize, well, what I'll do is I'll try to create a logical system. Oh no, right? And so you can't, right? The problem of translation and formalization is itself a non-formalizable problem, right? Like that's a meta problem, and that's the problem of relevance realization. If you,
Yeah, and
sorry,
how, John, does this relate to Gödel and to sort of the halting
it's
problems or like the computational
It's
stuff? Yeah.
related to that. It's related to the bias variance trade-off. It's related to the no free lunch theorem. All the technical argumentation is about grounding that in. It's related to the issue of computational tractability that I've been mentioning with combinatorial explosion. And the paper goes into that in much more, you know, I believe technically valid argumentation. I'm just trying to give you, and hopefully for the sake of your listeners, a gist of how you would make the argument that relevance realization is presupposed by all of the machinery of computation and therefore cannot ultimately be explained by computation.
Very interesting. And where in your model do you place phenomenal consciousness?
So, if you'll allow me, I always greet that question by first talking about the three meta questions, which is I think there are three questions. One is the nature question, which is how does something like phenomenal consciousness exist in a world that does not seem to have phenomenal consciousness or properties? And of course, the panpsychists are arguing with us, and the idealists are. But at least prima facie, what's going on in here seems very different without argumentation with what's going on out there. That's the nature problem, and I'm trying to say it in a way that's not presupposing an answer. And then the function problem is, what does consciousness do? Given that so much of your intelligent and sophisticated behavior, you're taking sounds and turning them into ideas in your mind that are about my mind. And you are not, I believe, not at all aware of all of the machinery that's making that happen for you. That is a wickedly hard problem, right? And you're doing it like that. So we seem to be able to do so much without consciousness. What's consciousness for? And then there's the third question. What's the relationship between the nature and the function question? So now, before I answer your question, I'll go through. I think, and this is one area where I agree with Descartes, just to give him some credit. I think you can't answer these two questions independently. I think you can't answer the function and the nature questions independently, because what you're always doing is smuggling in an answer to the other question as you're giving your answer. You're smuggling in a function answer as you're doing your nature, and vice versa. And I think a lot of the places, a lot of the popular theories sort of fail on that account. Um, so I think you have to answer the questions in an interconnected manner. And so what I do, and what Greg and I do, is we try to do this double-ended argument where you try to thicken the functional account, and you try to deepen your phenomenological the span and depth of your phenomenological experience until you get a place where they can touch. And that's what I propose doing. And I won't give the argument because, as you can expect, it's a long argument, but it goes something like this: that recursive relevance realization that is fundamental to your anticipatory intelligence gives you some important, obviously it gives you tremendous functionality. And then what you pay attention to as well, when do we seem to need consciousness? We seem to need consciousness when we can't do things automatically. What are the situations where we can't do things automatically? Where there's high novelty, where there's emergent uncertainty, that's what novelty means, where there's emergent uncertainty, ill-definedness, and complexity. Well, those are situations in which you better really ramp up and bootstrap your relevance realization really powerfully. And of course, this is why, consciousness overlaps with working memory, that there's chunking, and there's a whole
Hmm.
complex argument there. And the
Yeah.
idea is there's a deep interpenetration, and you can see this anatomically, between the areas that are running your fluid general intelligence, attention, working memory, and consciousness. And so that's the functional question. But here's the phenomenology. If you give me that recursive relevance realization, you're giving me perspectival knowing, you're giving me participatory coupling. So I can have a participatory knowing through my perspectival knowing. I'm doing salience landscaping. I'm foregrounding and backgrounding. There's a here-ness and a now-ness and a togetherness to my experience. But we call these the adverbial qualia. And as opposed to the adjectival qualia that philosophers love so much, the greenness and the blueness. But the here-ness and the now-ness and the togetherness and the intelligibility are also central. And then here's the point. You can have experiences of non-duality in which all the adjectival qualia and all the conceptual content go away, and yet you're still conscious. And what still remains are all the adverbial, because people have the ultimate here-ness, which is full presence, the ultimate nowness, eternity, the ultimate togetherness, oneness, and the ultimate intelligibility. It's so beautiful, right? So all the adverbial qualia are present, even though the adjectival are absent, the conceptual content is absent. And so we say that means if you can explain the adverbial qualia, you can explain some of the phenomenology of consciousness integrated with the functionality, and that phenomenology seems to at least be necessary and probably sufficient for consciousness, because people in the pure consciousness event don't have all the other qualia and they don't lose consciousness. So that's
This
the
one I
argument.
have to listen back, John. But I really like the fact how you combine that sort of functional and I've read. I hear you say when I heard you say it, I think that you have a point there, because the community, in sort of talking about the heart problem, it's always in that the redness of red and the qualia, and you don't think about
So do it.
that function. Yeah.
Yeah, do it this way, phenomenologically intuitive. Imagine that you had sort of you were some sort of Humean monster, and you had, I don't know, non here, non now, non together, non intelligible, I don't know what to call it, blips of redness. And like, is that consciousness? That doesn't strike me as consciousness at all. And part of our argument is, there's two arguments. We're arguing that if you give us transcendent naturalism, we can overcome the enlightenment gap that hamstrings us from addressing consciousness, and we've been talking about that a lot already. And then if you give us adverbial qualia, we can give some functional and phenomenological rapprochement, and we can at least shrink the explanatory gap and say, okay, we can't explain the adjectival qualia, but they seem to be neither necessary nor sufficient for consciousness. We don't deny their existence, but they don't seem to be necessary. They're absent from the pre-consciousness event, and they don't seem to be sufficient, because if I give you just that, like I just did a minute ago, you don't seem to have consciousness. If they're not necessary or sufficient, they're not essential to consciousness.
And I think I've read in mentoring the machines that you are open to the idea of conscious AR AI.
The LLMs don't actually possess relevance realization. They piggyback on our capacities. We organize the data. With our judgments of relevance realization, we encode our experience of relevance into probabilistic relationships between spoken terms or graphic terms. We organize the internet in terms of our judgments of relevance and salience, and then we give human-based reinforcement in order to teach the machines. So there's no scientific. So obviously, this is obviously the case. The account of how these machines are intelligent would not generalize to a chimp, would not generalize to an octopus. So it's not a scientific breakthrough in an understanding of intelligence. So that being said, I want to make it clear that I don't think the current machines could have consciousness, because I don't think the current machines can have recursive relevance realization. In order to have relevance realization, you have to have a lot of other things going on. And importantly, you have to have embodiment. Look, relevance is not cold calculation, it's not computation. It's about how you care about this information and you don't care about that information. And you care about this information because it matters to you, because you are a self-making thing. Your body is making itself and your mind is making itself. So you have real needs of matter and information that you must actually incorporate into your very being. So you have real needs, which means you're really taking care of yourself, which means you really care about information. And I think part of consciousness, and this is, this is a Heideggerian claim, is that caring, is that caring. So if we were to make these machines artificially intelligent, we would have to make them also artificially autopoietic. They'd have to be self-making in an important way, actually have genuine artificial affect, be capable of genuine caring. They would have to care about what's true and good and beautiful, so they would be disposed to correcting themselves, so they could be rational and not just intelligent. And I think if you put all of that machinery in, I think it would be difficult to deny them at least adverbial consciousness.
And here I see sort of link back in our how we started this conversation about sort of the meaning crisis and thinking about that a metaphor or a story that stuck with me when I made this documentary with Bernardo and Roger Penrose was that the story of Jorge Luis Borges, the Spanish, I think, writer who has this beautiful story of the Library of Babel. You know it?
Yeah,
It's
yes, of course. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, and here we have how it links for me to AI is that of course these models can write books like crazy or make videos, whatever. So we can imagine this library that fills itself with everything that can be written, being written. And then, of course, we humans are zombies in search of meaning in that library with bullshit, right?
Yeah.
And are even sort of in Borges' story, there is this beautiful because he describes how different sects arise. There are these sects of people in search of because in such a library there also must be a book that will guide you to every book that has meaning in it, right? There has to be that book as well, and so there's a sect in
Yeah.
search of that book. And it's just a funny and when I thought about that shit, that might is what might be dawning. Isn't that what might happen? An apocalypse of sort of the internet being taken over, like in if things go as they are now going. Sorry, I don't know how this links back, but it's just the thought I had when I heard you
No, no,
say all of this.
it
Yeah.
links back. It links back very well. I mean, part of what you're saying is there's a sense in which meaning is not an epiphenomena. Rationality is not an epiphenomena. Trying to come up with a rational meaning with rational meaning is not epiphenomenal to the kind of intelligence and agency we exercise in the world. And um, I, I I think this is what I meant when I said that theology is going to be the discipline of the future, because what's going to increasingly happen is people are going to start to give more and more priority to the non-propositional, non-computational aspects of their cognition, their non-dual states of consciousness, their somatic experiences of flow, right? These things that are largely ineffable and are not carried propositionally, and the kind of things that give us genuine moments of insight. I just saw this thing the other day. Human beings are like, we can take we can come up with a new test uh, for general intelligence that has never been put on the internet. I can give it to you, and you can do it like that. And then you give it to this machines, and they crap out completely. They don't have fluid intelligence. They only have what a psychologist would call crystallized intelligence. They don't have what you have, which is the ability to zero in on the relevant information in a novel, ill-defined, complex situation, right? And so um, I think we will put increasing emphasis on the non-propositional, ineffable, that puts us into relationship with the sort of inexhaustible depths and heights of our existence. And to my mind, that's what theology has always been about.
Yeah, and what also comes up with me, sort of the syntax-semantics divide. So
Mm.
the Chinese room experiment, I mean, that's an interesting one. Can it be bridged, right? Because that's the hope, I think, of people. If you just have the syntax of the machines, that somehow you can get to semantics. How do you regard that divide? To me, I'm not a schooled philosopher. It feels like a fundamental divide in reality, that of the syntactical, the
I
images,
think
and
what, yeah,
yeah.
and it goes back to that. If what you mean by syntax is a rule-governed formal system for the implication manipulation of propositional representations, I just gave you a whole bunch of argument,
Sorry,
which is
that's just how you. Could you say that? You could? Can you repeat it like that, John? How you just said that? That's just amazing. How you get at that?
well, what you mean is a rule-governed,
Yeah.
manipulation uh, of a formal system uh, in terms of implications between propositional representations. That's the syntax. That's what syntax stands for. And I just gave you arguments that syntax, you get an infinite regress about trying to get what is presupposed by the running or the operation of that syntax that can't be captured in the syntax. And you can turn that not only backwards, you can turn it forwards. Jerry Fodor, who's by the way who was one of the strongest proponents of the computational theory of mind. So I'm not from way out here. This is from like the core. It's what made him such a good researcher. He could criticize his own position so deeply. But he said, look, development going forward, if we're talking about qualitative development, not just taking in more information, but the capacity to take in more kinds of information, he said, look, if what we're talking about there is we're talking about not a change of content, but a change of competence. And then he says, okay, so let's talk about that syntactically. What would it be to improve your competence? Well, he says the only model we have that is going from a weaker logic to a stronger logic, a logic with more representational power. So from like, propositional logic to predicate logic to modal logic, etc. And then he made the devastatingly sort of confirmable point, which is ultimately Gödelian. There's no way I can run all possible computations within predicate calculus, and I'll never get modal logic because I have to step outside and from outside introduce an axiom and a new function. And so there is no way in which you can have qualitative development computationally. So not only can you not explain all the processes that are presupposed to getting to it, you can't explain how it can grow in competence going forward. Now, Fodor did something that I just disagree with as a scientist. He said, well, there must be no qualitative evidence, and Piaget's just wrong. And it's like, no, he's not. There's way too much empirical evidence that kids go through qualitative development. And so that turns Fodor's argument, I think, into a modus tollens, which means cognition can't be fundamentally computational. So both going backwards into what's presupposed to get to the syntax and going forward, how does it have, qualitative development? You can't get a computational account of that.
Yeah, and I'm here also because I did my research and not understand his argument fully because it's too deep into mathematics and physics. But I think that's the merit of Sir Roger Penrose also, right? That the amount of time he spent as a physicist trying to sort of grasp this, and he did this chess position. I had that in the documentary. It was sort of a novel chess position, very very weird one. When you sort of get to the other side, you with a pawn you can promote, right? And he did this crazy position that you don't promote to queen, but to a I forgot the English word. It's a loper. It's not. What's the other piece that can go diagonal?
Bishop, bishop.
Bishop. Sorry, that's it. The English word. Too Dutch for this. But you promote to a bishop, so now you have three bishops. Now that's a weird position. No one does it. You always promote to a queen, right? So you give that to an AI, and that then just goes bonkers because it doesn't. And it did very weird things. And a human average player could immediately sense what would be the next position. And in this sort of puzzle he made, it was that the solution was that it was a draw. It was an obvious draw. But the AI kept doing stupid stuff because it believed it could win. And he then has this whole argument going back to Gödel and the halting problem. And I really like that because it's so visual to me. And then, of course, he goes quantum. But that's, I think, about, that was a question I had. How much you are into physics and what's happening sort of in the foundations of physics, or you see that as sort of a discipline related, but not of direct
Well,
interest to your
first of
work.
all, before I criticize, I'll strengthen Penrose. I haven't met him, so I'll call him Penrose.
Yeah.
Uh, so fairly recently, about the same, I think the same year that GPT-4 came out, uh, we had these super AIs that could beat any Go master easily,
Yeah.
readily, right?
Yeah, which is
And then
more
what
complex than chess, right? Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
then what they had is there was a couple of human beings that notice the language I'm using that noticed that the machine had a particular sort of presupposition in it, put the presupposition into play, and was able to just a middle range player was able to defeat the best of the Go AIs. Just right, and it's the same kind of argument again. It's like because you can't like uh, the you can't this capacity of sort of noetic self-transcendence that's bound up with consciousness and bound up with rationality isn't captured. Look, even in human beings, measures of intelligence are only weakly to medianly predictive of rationality. They're far from identity. So just making something intelligent does not make it rational. And I think by parity of argument, we can make similar claims. Now about the quantum, I don't know what to make about that. I mean, first of all, let's give credit where credit is due. Um, I think we have very good evidence that the sense of smell is making use of quantum mechanics. I think I think it would be wrong as a scientist. Just I think the evidence is now compelling that somehow you can distinguish fragrances or odors because of quantum level differences, and so something's going on there. Um, we don't have Now, to be fair to me, we don't have any evidence like that for sight or hearing or even for touch, right? Taste will probably turn out to be that because taste and smell are so interwoven. But the three distal senses, and even touch isn't that's distal, but those ones, because you have this extra problem of going from the proximal to the distal, right? There seems to be a huge thing that isn't well explained by invoking quantum mechanics in some fashion. And here's the other side of the argument. Most of your behavior that's using uh, that's not primarily relying on smell, which is most of your behavior, right? You show the kinds of errors and constraints and mistakes that you would be expected is if you were dealing with massive issues of relevance realization in which you couldn't do superpositioning to cover all the possible right, and then get the collapse out of it. So why, if you have quantum computation and it's available, why is it that you fall prey to the confirmation bias or the representational heuristic or the availability heuristic or the my side bias, etc., 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 etc.? Why aren't we? Why do we not have angelic causal cognitive agency? And we don't. We are very prone to self-deception. We make all kinds of experimentally repeatable mistakes that seem to indicate we are facing computational limitations that would only be the case if we were doing something that was understood from a classical computational or classical physics kind of framework.
Very
So
nice
those,
to hear your reflection on this, and there's a lot to be said here. But I'll make sure to send you, if you like it, a copy of a book our foundation has just released by Federico Fargini. He's the founder of, he's the inventor of the first microprocessor chip, the Intel 404, and now he has a quantum theory of consciousness, and it is speculative, it is highly theoretical, but very interesting because it is very compatible with certain work done now in the foundations of physics. But I'll send it to you. Just
yeah.
you might
See,
find it very interesting. Yeah,
so if I would
yeah,
greatly appreciate the book, but my pushback on that would be, look, I don't want initially you to tell me how your theory of consciousness is compatible with physics. I want your theory of consciousness to tell me how it's compatible with cognition.
mm,
Because if you
yeah.
can't do that, I don't care about the compatibility with physics. I'd care about it ontologically out here, but as somebody trying to understand cognition, which I
Yeah,
think,
I agree. I agree. Yeah. And this is also why I just spoke to Michael Levin, by the way, and it's also his argument that you can look at sort of a quantum level what happens when you play chess. I mean, all the atoms in the pieces. We
yeah,
just had the chess.
yeah,
And does
yeah,
it make
yeah,
sense? No, not at all. So
yeah.
I feel you there. John, just to sort of going to an end of our beautiful conversation, um, you're highly analytic. You remind me very much of Bernardo, and that's also why I think the two of you are such good companion to discuss things. But you also have your foundation, and you do sort of the transcendent work with young people. And I'm just very curious of some maybe stories to share here that you find beautiful, where you see sort of all that analytic, that thinking, sort of really resulting in that transcendence, so to speak, with the people you work with, or even perhaps personally. But I'm just very interested here.
Yeah, so to not fall into performative contradiction, and I think performative contradictions are worse than merely propositional contradictions. I think I would say I would conclude, I would conclude that nobody is going to find alleviation from the meaning crisis, amelioration, alleviation by following out the analytics of my arguments. Instead, what I hear from, I think they're important because I think you should do science. And so I'm doing cognitive science, and that's where I feel I need to do that, right? And I also feel I need to do that because it lends plausibility and legitimacy, right? And then that's important too. But what I find most, what I get very often from people, and most encouraging, is people will say, "You gave me you gave me a conceptual vocabulary, you gave me a theoretical grammar so that I could make sense of my experience in a way that encouraged me to take up, because now I could understand this practice and that practice and how they could fit together. And then I moved into an ecology of practices that have had this huge transformation on me." And that, Hans, is exactly what I aspired to. That is exactly what I wanted to happen. Putting aside the need to do good science, which I do think you need to do, but insofar as I'm trying to alleviate the meaning crisis, the analytics is completely in service, subservient to just giving people a way of thinking and reflecting on their phenomenology and their meaning making such that practices become legitimate and plausible. And they also have a way of correcting and vetting and saying, I think that's just a woo practice. This one sounds like it's got a good chance of actually being real. Hey, these two complement each other or counterbalance each other in a really nice way. And that, for me, that's what really goes into my heart, is making me feel that I've done some good in the world.
Yeah, yeah, very beautiful. And funny thing in I think all the analytic and all the thinking, and it's also for Bernardo, and then that's all about that thin description in a sense, right? It's to
Yeah, it is. But
that's funny. That's funny. Yeah,
but it's
because
it's
people. Yeah, yeah.
well, it's the Wittgensteinian thing, right? Right, where you often have to go into this very complex stuff because you're trying to unwind these very complex knots,
Mm.
right? And get to a possibility where you can come back to saying, "Oh, wait, let's go back and reconsider X that we buried under all this knotted thought and ink, right? And go back and, oh, wait, yes." And so
Yeah, and your own ecology of practice, how does that sort of play out in an average week when you also have a lot of commitments and stuff? How do you fit it in, and what is that ecology?
I mean, so you have to be adaptive, especially when you're traveling. So what I did is I've come up with my regular is like an hour and a half. I go for a walk and then I do sort of an hour and a half or so of practice. But I also have shorter versions.
Meditation.
Oh, more than meditation. So I do some Jeet Kune Do. I do some Fijin and some sword form. Then I do slow, empty-handed Tai Chi Chuan, the long form as it's called. I do some Jan Jung, which is sort of standing and holding. Some I Chuan, which is kind of a moving thing in the family of Qigong. I'm doing all of that, and then I sit and I do sort of practices for cultivating prajna. I do some meditative practices, some contemplative practices, practices that are more sort of Zen in their orientation, counterbalanced by practices that are sort of more Neoplatonic. And so I practice what I preach. There's a very there's stillness practices counterbalanced with movement practices. There's meditation practices counterbalanced by contemplative practices. There are practices that dive deep into your experience. That's very Zen. There's practices that dive very deep into your intelligibility. That's Neoplaton. Like, I'm doing everything I'm talking about, and we talk about the design principles at the Vervaeke Foundation. We have the acronym DIME. You want dialogical practices, and I do that with other people. There's philosophical fellowship. There's dialectic into dialogos. We're workshopping another one right now called the Socratic search space. There's dialogical practices. You want imaginal practices. You want mindfulness practices, and you want embodiment practices of some kind. So dime. So you want dime, and then you don't want just a hodgepodge. You want ones that challenge you and that are complementary and counterbalance each other like an ecology. And that's what I do every morning. But I have three versions. I have the full hour and a half, a more hour one, a half an hour one, and a 15-minute one if I'm, laying over in a hotel and I've got to get up at 3 a.m. and blah, blah, blah kind of thing. Right. So, and I strongly advise people to do that because this is something I say to my students. Continuity of practice is more important than quantity of practice. So give yourself different versions of your practice. Be honest. Can I do the hour and a half? Do it. I honestly can only do the hour. Do it. I can honestly only do the half hour. Do it. I can honestly only do the 15 minutes. Do it. And if you can't do the 15 minutes, you're being held hostage or something. I don't know what's going on. So like that's what I do. And I have that repertoire. And I'm not claiming it to be a saint, but by and large, I honestly apply the one that is appropriate given to me by the constraints that I'm facing exigently at that time.
Great, and that's a lot. It's very nice to see how you sort of have put together this sort of delicate menu, so to speak. For people interested in this, they can go to your foundation's website, I guess, or could be
Yeah, or
put
go
links
to
links in our description.
yeah. So I mean, if they're interested in the more scientific stuff, they can track down my publications. If they're interested in the videos, they've got my YouTube channel. They can see Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. After Socrates, they can see all the cognitive science shows on transcendent naturalism and consciousness. If they're interested in the practices, we have the platform called Awaken to Meaning. Awaken to Meaning, you can go there and then you'll get all this information. And there's from drop-in, right, from drop-ins to weekend workshops to intensive courses, etc. We are not a community. We make this very clear. I'm not going to build a community. That is not who I
Not a
am.
guru, not a guru,
Not
no
right.
religion. No.
We're a dojo. We're a base camp. We're where you can go to train so that you can start to cultivate wisdom individually and collectively with other people so that you can more better find or co-create with other people a community. That's what we are.
And sort of a meta question. When I just made this switch, right, we talked about sort of the analytic hard stuff and very much the stuff I talk a lot about for the Essentia Foundation. And then we go a bit more personal, how you practice this daily. I always sense sort of that this switch is somewhat difficult. Not that, I mean, your answer is beautiful, but how's that for you as an academic, talking about stuff like this? So talking about these deep personal practices, has that become more easy or is it still hard sometimes?
I mean, in general, many of this, like I think I was the first person academically at the University of Toronto to talk about mindfulness, and I sort of had to introduce it sort of very quietly and sort of, by the way, and now of course, there's academic journals on it and blah blah, but by and large, I think I think it's fair to say I've been successful at convincing people that I can do I can be responsible to good science while talking about these topics. So, but there are still moments where I go to what you might call the cutting edge and that sort of that difficult place you're putting your finger on between the personal life and the professional life. Like when I talked about some of the stuff that happened to me while I was doing IFS and the ally work and things like that. And a lot of people were like, whoa. But but again, and then I went out and I would say, but look, this is what's happening in the psychotherapeutic world, right? These dialogical parts practices are gaining a lot of traction. The cog sci is moving towards that the self is not monological but is dialogical in nature, and it's not in you, it's extended, embedded, enacted, all that. And then people go, oh, and I say, yes, right. And then you can go back and understand that cross culturally, cross historically, people are reporting these kinds of experiences and taking up practices. And instead of being ethnocentric or just, I don't know, reductive and saying silly, silly superstition, you might actually stop and think, hey, maybe there's a real phenomena going on. Now, I want to be clear here. There's a lot of bullshit. There's a lot of charlatans. There's a lot of woo, but that doesn't mean there aren't real phenomena. So I still bump into, at least initially, people go, whoa, 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 whoa. But I've sort of earned enough cred that people at least give me a chance now. They wouldn't have given me that chance 15 or 20 years ago, but now they do. And so it's not as hard for me as it used to be.
Yeah, you've built something up, and of course now there's so much momentum, I think, worldwide. And just final question, a bit more about that personal. You've described how you do your practice, and we talked a lot about the thin description. What was your last moment of strong transcendence that you are willing to share? I mean, it's a bit personal,
Um,
perhaps.
I mean, in one sense, I daily have an experience of strong transcendence in that I have the language is bedeviling me because I don't want to say I, but I realize non-duality, but not in any sort of closed way, in a way in which I feel like, um, well, Nishitani talks about. He says the heart of religion is um, the the real self-realization of reality, and I get to that place where there's the real self-realization of reality for its own sake, and I am doing deep perspectival and participatory participation in that. I that happens to me now on a daily basis because I've been practicing for like 3 decades. Now, sometimes what happens is that will open up into something a, what and there's things that are practically profound where you get oh and then you know how to do a practice better, but if you say it to somebody they go yeah so what, and then there are things that are more theoretically profound where you there's this and it's never in it, but when you come out of it you go oh right. And what happened now, so I'm going to answer your question now. I had strong transcendence. I was in non-duality, and I had been already arguing this, but I wasn't doing that in my head. I want that very clear. I imagine there's some maybe unconscious processing happening. I don't deny that, but where I realized that when if you're talking about pure relationality, it's not just an inversion. So substance ontology is the relata, the things are there, and the relations emerge out of them. One thing you could do is just say, oh, well, I'll invert it, and the relations are there, and the relata emerge out of it. And what I realized is that is fundamentally wrong. The inversion is just the same problem, and there's a symmetry argument against it. And that what I needed was right a formulation that was neither right the relations come from the relata or the relata come from the relations, but the codependent arising right of them. And then as soon as I had that thought coming out of the non-duality, it felt like I had been more true to and authentic to the non-duality.
Thank you very much, John. I think this is a beautiful thing for people to ponder out how you close this.
Well, thank you very much, Hans. This has been wonderful. And please say hi to Bernardo for me. I always have a lot of respect. I think I hope that came through whenever I was talking about it because that is really my attitude towards him, one of respect and affection. And there's a lot of convergence between he and I around trying to deal with the meaning crisis. So thank you for this wonderful conversation. And I'm glad you're doing it. A lot of this, we need more of this. We just need more of this. And so thank
Yeah,
you.
and people like you are the inspiration in a sense for the stuff we're doing, the output, the rigor, all the thinking that goes into it, and the fact that you practice it. I think that's to me really inspiration. And I know that it's completely mutual what you're saying about Bernardo. He really appreciates what you're doing, and as you high, yeah.
Thank you so
Okay.
much.